Exodus chapter 1, I'm going to start reading in verse 8. It says, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses, and but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service, in the field. All their service, wherein they made them serve, was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him, but if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive." And we'll stop there for right now, and let's have a word of prayer. You can go ahead and be seated. Think about the scenario that we have here in the passage that we just read. Joseph, that we looked at last week, has been a ruler in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh in the throne. The famine was bad enough that the Israelites moved to Egypt for food, which was really good while Joseph was alive. That worked. But now he's gone, and worse than that, now the Pharaoh who knew Joseph and who had approved all this is gone also. And the new king is realizing that the Israelites are quickly outnumbering him. You see that in those first couple of verses. And while it's all working out right now, his fear is, well, if at some point we go to war and they decide they like our enemies more than us, they're going to outnumber us. They're going to take us just by pure numbers. You know, Egyptians would have had trained soldiers and weapons that the Israelites may not have had. But, weapons only get you so far when you're outnumbered by too many people. I like to wrestle with my kids, and they like it. But obviously, I'm a lot bigger than my kids. So if it's just me against any one of them, well, it's an obvious I'm going to win. Josh really enjoys it, and because of it, will try pretty hard. But one-on-one, it doesn't matter how hard Josh tries. I'm a lot bigger than Josh. I can win. But if the others start joining in, it gets a lot harder. At this point, I can still beat them all, but the older they get, the more difficult that becomes, and the harder I actually have to try to do this. To a point last year, wrestling with them, I was messing around with the younger two, and so I was on my knees kind of wrestling with them, and Josh decided he was going to try and tackle me, and dove, and in the process broke my nose. It's getting harder to beat them when they're all working together. But that's in essence what the Egyptians are fearing. That while they may be better trained and those sorts of things, that if the Israelites get too many men, that they'll win anyways. So the king has the idea, and his first idea is, well, we're going to make them our servants, where they're going to have to work and they're going to do all this. And the Bible puts it that the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied. Well, this isn't working, so we have to come up with a new plan. We can't stop them from having kids, but what we can do is, since they come to our midwives, we'll have them kill every male. But there's one major factor that the king forgot about, and that's that Israel was God's people, and that God is with his people. God's with his people even when it may not feel like it. I think, everyone here can probably relate to those times where you feel like God isn't there. And that's what's happening in this passage. God is with the children of Israel, but this is a time where they may not have felt like it. When you have someone oppressing you, and someone who is as the passage puts it, afflicting them, that's going to be a time where you're not feeling like God's right there with you. They're in another country where they were at one time favored, But now all of a sudden they've become enemies. They're slaves to the Egyptians and being told that their sons all have to be killed when they're born. So it'd been another one of those times where you'd feel alone, where you would have thought that God wasn't there, but God was still there. God's with this people even when it doesn't feel like it. And the same is true for us. Though there are times where we feel alone, we aren't. I don't know if you ever spent much time thinking about it. It's something I like to think about. Knowing that no matter how alone I feel, that God is still right there beside me. God is with His people, even when it doesn't feel like it. God's with His people, even when they walk away from Him. And that is to a point what we're seeing with the children of Israel in this. They've stopped serving God. They aren't spiritually where they ought to be. They've been in Egypt long enough that rather than worshiping God, they've spent enough time there that they've started to follow the lies of the other gods, started to worship them, and they've walked away some from God. But what's amazing is that though they have walked away from God, God hasn't left them. And we see proof of that later on when they call out to God and He hears their cry. More than just hearing their cry, and what I think is really neat about it is He doesn't just hear their cry and say, oh yeah, I'll start working on a plan, but He's already brought up Moses well before they cry. Though they were ignoring Him, He wasn't ignoring them. The very same thing is true in our lives. There are times that we make decisions and in that we are choosing other things over God. Things that we choose to walk away from God to follow after. Maybe messes that we get ourselves into, and when we realize our mistake and that we need help to get out of it, God hasn't gone anywhere. He's listening for our cry with a plan already in place. Now I say all of that though to set the stage for the passage tonight. I see three areas in this that we can see God in the birth and the childhood of Moses. The first is God in, I'm just going to word it this way, God in His birth. Look at verses 16 and 17. It says, and He said, when you do the office of the midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him, but if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. The king has given a decree. This isn't exactly an optional thing for the midwives, but God. And they give an excuse, and I didn't read it. When you get to verse 18, the king of Egypt called for the midwives. This is after they've saved the men children alive. The king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, why have ye done this thing and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. They give him an excuse. It's what they're doing. I mean, because the passage very clearly says they didn't do it because they feared God, but then they go into Pharaoh and say, oh, they had the kid before we got there. We couldn't do anything. The Bible makes it clear they feared God. It's not as though they just like the Israelite women. It's not like, they just have been, not like they are not as prejudiced as the king was. They would have had the same feelings as he did toward them. It had nothing to do with any of that. It didn't have to do with them being tender-hearted. I read this week someone who said that these women saw the babies and they just couldn't do it. And you know how a baby does that. It doesn't matter how big and tough a person is, a baby just kind of melts them. I had a friend who was always kind of thought of himself as a tough guy. He never wanted anyone to see a side of him other than being big and tough. And then he got married and his wife got pregnant and they had a little girl. And this big tough guy went everywhere carrying around this little bundle of pink. And a baby just changes things. You have this big tough guy carrying pink and talking baby talk. And there are some that try to claim that that's what happened here, that they intended to follow through with the king's order, but then they saw the baby and they had a change of heart. They just felt too bad to do it. But that isn't what the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us that the problem was they feared God. They didn't follow the king's order because they feared God more than they feared the king. The first place that we can see God in this passage is God in His birth. The second place we can see God in this passage is God in the river. Look at verses, I'm going to start reading in verse 22, the last verse of chapter 1, then we're going to go into chapter 2. It says, "And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive. And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took a wife, a daughter of Levi, and the woman conceived, and bare a son, and when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months, and when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink, and his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him." So the king's plan hasn't worked out. His first plan failed of we're just going to afflict them and that's going to stop them. Well, no, they multiplied more. So now we're going to try this midwives. Well, that doesn't work. He thought he had a foolproof plan with the midwives. First ones who touch the babies and tell them to kill every male. It seems right except for God. So he has to put a new plan in place, and he still can't let all these boys keep being born or they'll be outnumbered. But his first one didn't work. His second plan didn't work. So the new plan, he tells every Egyptian, when you see a baby boy, in essence, I'm paraphrasing this, but when you see a baby boy, throw him in the river. Which is a terrible thing. I mean, there's really no other way to put it. I've personally long thought that one of the worst, probably, I wouldn't even say one of, in my mind, the worst way to die would be drowning. My dad always talks about the crabs eating you if you drown. I don't even care about the crabs eating me. Once I'm dead, they can eat me all they want to. It's the idea of drowning that I don't really like. It's been a few years now, but Bo and I and his family and mine, we took our Jeeps that we had at the time up to a glacier lake up in the mountains. And Bo had brought this little rubber raft, and so he and I decided we were going to do some fishing, and there was absolutely no fish in the lake at all. So we went over to an island that was in the middle of the lake. And it was like 10 foot off the water, and the water's really deep below it, so I started jumping off it. If fishing's not going to work, I might as well have some fun. So I started jumping off the island into the lake, and I did that a handful of times, jump off, swim to the island, do it again. The last time I did, Bo was ready to head back, so I told him to go ahead and that I would jump off, and I'd just swim back to the shore where we were camping. Which, it didn't look far, and I'm a strong swimmer, but one thing I hadn't really thought about is glacier water's really cold. Really, really cold. So I hadn't gotten very far into my swim when I realized my muscles were all cramping up, and that wasn't going to happen. I was nowhere close to where I needed to be, but far enough from the island that I wasn't going to get back there either. Thankfully, Bo can paddle a little rubber raft pretty quickly and pick me back up. But the idea of drowning just doesn't sound pleasant to me. And I've had a few close calls now, but while it doesn't sound pleasant for me, worse for a baby. While if I was thrown into a river, I might make it to the side, a baby wouldn't. They'd be completely helpless. And that's that is exactly what's supposed to happen to Moses. He would have been completely vulnerable, except God. Think of a couple factors that God played in this situation. The first is, in my mind, a baby was quiet for 3 months. I mean, if you've had kids, a baby was quiet for 3 months. Lisa and I have 3 of them. There's no way a baby being quiet for 3 months can be explained as anything but God. I mean, there's no other way. That when Zach was born, for the first, more than a year, I was convinced that he hated me, because if Lisa left or if Lisa wasn't in the room, he immediately started crying. And we're not talking just a little crying. My parents can vouch for this. We're not talking just, a whimper. We're talking he would scream from the minute she was out of sight at the top of his lungs, and not only for a few minutes, and then, everyone said, let him cry for 5 minutes, he'll forget about it and move on. Not him. He would scream until she came back in the room. The entire time. It didn't matter if that was 5 minutes or 4 hours, he screamed. It didn't matter if I tried to feed him, change him, none of it mattered. He screamed until she walked in the door, and he immediately would stop. The point, if a baby starts crying and scream, there are times you just can't quiet him. Kaylee, as a baby, was terrified, and I still haven't figured out why, but was terrified of men. If any man other than my dad or myself even looked at her, she cried and couldn't be calmed down. But for 3 months, they're able to keep Moses quiet enough that no one knew. Try and tell me how that can be anything but God. God was in it. God was in it in the fact that the baby stayed in the ark. I mean, you think about it, babies squirm. Babies move. I can't tell you the amount of times that I was holding one of our kids and playing with them, and they started to squirm and you almost drop them, and you never admit that to their mom until they're now old enough she can't be too mad. That wouldn't have worked too well in this situation. When I wrote this, I thought she was going to be a nursery, so that I was going to get away with that. All of a sudden, as I was saying, I thought, ooh, I noticed she walked in there. Yeah. That wouldn't have worked in this situation, though. Had Moses squirmed too much, he could have, squirmed right out of this little ark. I don't know exactly the construction of the thing. The Bible tells us what it was made out of, but I would think a little boat made of weeds and mud, which is what this is. It's twigs and mud. A little boat made of weeds and mud, wouldn't be too hard for a kid to destroy if they moved around too much. And then he'd be in real trouble. God was in it. God was in Moses surviving through it. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us what river it is, so I understand that I'm taking, just a little bit of license here. But there is a river in Egypt that has a crocodile named after it. Can you imagine what would have happened had one of those found this little boat of weeds and mud? Can you imagine what would have happened there? I mean, a baby floating down a river, as if a baby floating down a river by himself in a boat made of weeds and mud wasn't bad enough. You're more than likely in an area where there would have been crocodiles and any other sort of dangers. But Noah survived it all, not because of his parents, not because of his sister who followed and watched, obviously not because anything that the 3-month-old baby Moses did. Moses survived the river portion of this because God was with him in the river. God protected him from any dangers that could have happened to him. God was with him. God was with him in when he was born in the river, and then last this evening, God was with Pharaoh's daughter. Now, you start thinking about this entire scenario, and bear with me for a moment. The odds of this all working are slim to none. If you were, going odds, I know we know better than the odds of this, but bear with me. A child surviving, floating down a crocodile-infested river in a little boat made of weeds and mud. And then, as if that wasn't enough, what a coincidence that it was at the exact same time Pharaoh's daughter was in the river. And wouldn't you know it, she saw the ark and the Israelite baby inside and decided, I don't need to follow my dad's commandment to dump this little weed boat over. No, instead I'm going to bring this child into my dad's home who wants him dead and raise him as my own. There's no part of that works. I mean, not even one of those parts. None of them work if it wasn't for God. It was God. It was God who brought the daughter of Pharaoh to the river at that exact moment. I don't, again, as I said earlier, don't know what river it was. The passage doesn't tell us. But if that ark got caught in the current, the timing would have had to have been perfect. It wasn't just by chance that Pharaoh's daughter came to the river at that moment and at that place. It wasn't as though Moses' parents planned it all out. I don't believe, they knew that every day at 11 o'clock Pharaoh's daughter comes down here, so we're going to launch this little weed boat out here and put the baby in there right at that time so she'll find him. It wasn't that. It was all put together by God. It was God who caused the daughter of Pharaoh to have compassion. If you look at chapter 2, verse 6, and when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept, and she had compassion on him, and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. It's clear that she knew this was a Hebrew child. It tells us very clearly. She said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. I have no doubt that she knows her dad's order to kill all of the male Hebrew babies. And like the midwives, I don't believe it's just that she had a soft spot for babies because the baby cried. And everyone knows that when you have someone else's kid and it cries, you look for a mom to give it back to, not say, ooh, I want to keep it and raise it for my own. And I'm kidding, sort of, but the point being that this was God. It was God who allowed Moses to still be raised by his parents and, better yet, be paid for being raised by his parents. They put their baby in this little boat of weeds and mud, probably thinking he's going to die. I mean, what could possibly happen? Every time I read this passage, I think that they had his sister watch to see what would happen. They want to scar this child. I mean, in my mind, because there is, unless you're trusting God, there is no good scenario here for the sister to watch. What could possibly happen? Even if he doesn't get eaten or drowned, there isn't a lot of food for a 3-month-old in a mud boat. Instead, they're still able to raise their child and be part of his life, and I'm sure teach him what God's people believe. That doesn't happen if not God. It was God who caused Pharaoh to allow this. Pharaoh, who's just given a decree not that long ago that all the Hebrew boys that were born had to be cast in the river, and now his daughter comes home saying, Daddy, can I keep him? I mean, I know part of that may have been because, it's hard for a dad to tell his daughter no. Lisa says all the time that her and I balance each other out. That's what she tries to tell me. Because I would tell Kaylee yes to just about anything she asked for, and Lisa has to keep me grounded on that. But this isn't just that Pharaoh can't tell his daughter no. This is God. This is God who can soften the heart of Pharaoh, who wants this boy dead, but allows him to be raised in his home. I can't help but think, there has to be some awkward moments when you're telling all of your people, I want you to kill all of the Hebrew baby boys, but I'm going to raise one. It's God. All this comes back to the point of God was with his people. God was with his people when Moses was born and the midwives wouldn't kill him, and God was with Moses to keep him quiet for the first 3 months, and God was with Moses when his family put him in a little boat made of twigs and mud and sent him to crocodile-infested waters, and God was with Moses when Pharaoh's daughter found him. Here's what it all boils down to, and what I'll do as far as a conclusion tonight. God was with Moses I'm going to put it this way, in his most vulnerable moment. Because you don't get a whole lot more vulnerable than what we've looked at and I've explained throughout this message. But through all of it, God was there. Through all of it, God was there. It brings me back to my terrible rhyme from last week when we're going through a vulnerable time where we feel all alone, like no one you can turn to. Don't despair. God's there. As I've been studying for this series and specifically for this message, my mind keeps going back to Hebrews 13:5, where it says, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. It doesn't matter where you are, what you've done, what you're going through, God's there. My kids have been witnessing to one of the neighbor kids. Actually, find it interesting, or find it a blessing. The night that I have this written in the message, he actually came with them to services tonight. But they've been witnessing to him for a while since we moved into this house, and he's been getting interested over the last couple of weeks. So anytime he sees me outside, he comes to ask me a question about the Bible, which has been fun. So the other day he started asking me, he worded it, how can God be here with you and across town at the same time? How does that work? And I explained to him, well, God's omnipresent, which means he's everywhere. all at the same time. Which brought a whole bunch of other questions of, how is that possible? I mean, how can he be? So, explaining a bunch with him that, and in that, God is more than just here and he's across town, but he's here and he's in Africa and he's in Russia and he's all of those places all at once. And I think as adults, we underplay what that means. We kind of just, oh yeah, God's everywhere. But as a kid's perspective who hadn't heard that before, as I explained it to him, all of a sudden it was like it clicked in his head, and he goes, wow, that's super cool. and he goes, so then he stopped and he goes, so wherever I am, God is too? And it's like, yeah, it's exactly, which is exactly what I'm trying to get us to see with this series, that wherever we are, whatever we're facing, God's there. We just need to learn to trust Him. We just need to be like the parents of Moses and put the baby in a twig and mud boat and give it to God. To take whatever it is that we are facing and say, God, it's yours. Let's pray.